Good evening. You are listening to Right on Campus, the UW-Eau Claire College Republican podcast. Good evening. You're listening to Right on Campus, the UW-Eau Claire College Republicans podcast. As always, I'm Ryan, the Vice Chair of the UWEC College Republicans, and I'm joined with my co-host and working partner, Tatiana, the Chair of UWEC College Republicans. We have a great episode for you tonight. Tonight, we'll be discussing the upcoming election on April 1st. With that being said, let's get into the show. So before we get started, we wanted to go through the main three that are on your ballot on April 1st. So the first of these candidates / referendums is Supreme Court candidate Brad Schimel. The second is State Superintendent candidate Brittany Kinser. And the third then would be voter ID. So yes or no on a constitutional amendment requiring voter identification in order to vote. Before we get started with all that, I wanted to start with the Supreme Court election. Before we talk about Brad Schimel, I wanted to go through what is the Wisconsin State Supreme Court? How do you get on the ballot? How do you get elected? So the first thing that needs to happen is a filing for candidacy. So candidates need to go around and gather nomination signatures to qualify for the ballot. This number of signatures varies depending on which level of the court you're seeking to run for. So after you receive your nomination filing signatures, you are then able to file the candidacy paperwork with the Wisconsin Elections Commission to officially enter the race. From there, primary happens. So if there's two conservative candidates which are being backed, they're going to need a primary. Same with the liberals. If there's 2 or 3 or 5 or however many.
Since it's nonpartisan, does it work where like the conservatives go against each other, or is it like all 3 of them get placed?
Yeah, that's actually the way it is.
Okay.
It's because technically they're nonpartisan. It's kind of a primary battle between all of the candidates.
Okay, and then top 2. So you could theoretically have 2
liberal candidates or 2 conservatives.
Okay,
yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah, but because there was only 2 running this time, it was just kind of partisan, straight down party lines. So there was no need for a primary. From there, we get to where we are now. So this is the general election period. It's held on the first Tuesday in April of odd-numbered years. So this is 2025, so the first Tuesday of April is April 1st, and that's when we're holding our election. Then, obviously, the candidate with the most vote wins.
Okay.
So that's where we're at. Wisconsin Supreme Court, when you're elected to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, you serve a 10-year term.
Yeah, it's not like the national where you...
Right,
it's
exactly.
to life, yeah.
It's not a life appointment. It's a 10-year tenure. The election cycle is actually staggered, so one justice is elected every 2 years. So every 2 years, there's a turnover in the election. And now this is notwithstanding anybody who drops out. If you just walk away, then the governor actually has the ability to appoint an interim. So that was where I was going next, is there's interim appointments. If a judicial seat becomes vacant before the election, the governor then appoints a judge to serve until the next scheduled election. And then obviously the difference between an interim appointment judge and then an elected judge is the elected judge is elected, and then they serve their full term.
Okay.
So yeah, with that all being said, let's jump into the Republican Party-backed or conservative candidate, Brad Schimel.
Yeah, for sure. So Brad Schimel, as Ryan mentioned, is who the Republican-backed candidate is, and he's running against Susan Crawford, who is who the Democrats and liberals endorse. And so this is all because Justice Ann Walsh Bradley is retiring. And so, yeah, so kind of like his background and where he came from and how the heck he got to this point. So he started out as a prosecutor, and he was really well known for being tough on crime. He was very passionate about working with the people and prosecuting. He was prosecuting like tough crimes, like not just your run-of-the-mill.
Right, as district attorney.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was, elder abuse, human trafficking, sexual abuse, homicide, like
rape.
Yeah, like
murder,
this is like the
aggressive
big stuff.
crimes, violent crimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as, a prosecutor, he's talking on behalf of these families that, of these victims. And that means he's the shoulder for them to rely on and cry on. And, that's a big role. And he then moved on to be elected as Wisconsin Attorney General in 2015. And he became known as the top cop of Wisconsin because he worked so well with law enforcement. And there's a lot of controversy around the rape kits.
Okay, let's talk about it.
Yeah, no, for sure. So before he got into office, there was rape kits that had not been tested for decades.
Okay.
Like for a long time. And so he sent out like a letter to each county requiring them to test the rape kits. But he didn't stop at that. If those that had not started to send them in, he called them. Called the sheriff directly and said, hey, can you check, your back room for any rape kits? And then started this initiative to begin testing these rape kits that had not been tested. And so, and he had to work around different bureaucratic side of things that were preventing him from even beginning this. But eventually he got it rolling, and most of the kits were tested. A few weren't, just because victims don't always want to have them tested.
Okay.
Which is up to the victim, whether or not that happens. And so, he, through this process and just through everything he did as Wisconsin Attorney General, he built like a very strong relationship with a lot of these sheriffs.
Okay.
And actually now he's backed by 75% of the sheriffs in Wisconsin.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a great endorsement.
You compare that to Susan Crawford.
Okay.
Who is backed by one sheriff.
Okay.
And it's Dane County.
Oh, nice.
And with that, he's backed by 75%, and not all 75% are conservative Republican sheriffs.
Right, elected sheriffs.
So, and then since, 2019, he moved on from Attorney General and became a circuit court judge, and that's where he's been kind of since.
In Waukesha County, right?
Yep.
Yep.
And so, kind of more on those endorsements he's had quite a few. I mentioned the sheriffs, which I think is a really big one. There's also almost every hunting organization and sportsmanship organization. And I believe the NRA might have endorsed.
I saw that the Wisconsin Bear Hunters Association dropped their endorsement. That's a pretty big one.
Yeah, there was some really good ones. Different rifle associations, that type of stuff. You see a lot of them. There was a few fire departments.
Oh, great.
Stuff like that. And so, all sorts of endorsements there. But his biggest endorsement is from Mr. President Donald J. Trump.
President Donald Trump endorses Brad Schimel.
Yes.
Wouldn't be a podcast without the Trump impression.
No, that's so real. So, yeah. So Trump came out and posted on his X that, he fully endorsed Brad, talked about how important this election is. And so, yeah. So why is this election so important?
Yeah.
I think people are kind of like, it's just a Supreme Court race. It's a local race. Like,
which is really unfortunate.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, it's a local race, which I think is actually more important because you have more impact. But there's a lot of things at stake here because we just lost our conservative majority on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin last year.
Yeah.
And
Judge Janet Protasiewicz.
Right.
Shoot.
But this gives us a chance to get that back. And if we don't get that back, another conservative judge will be stepping down within the next year or two. And
they'll stack it.
They'll just continue, And so a liberal judge isn't set to step down, I believe, until 2030.
Wow.
So it's either 2028 or 2030. I don't remember which.
Yeah.
But so, there's a lot more at stake for conservatives than there is for the liberal side. But as far as issues that are going to be decided, school choice and parental rights is a possible one that may or may not, end up before the courts. And Crawford has said that she's never come out and said, I don't support school choice, but she has criticized Walker and his administration for prioritizing private education. And that's concerning.
Yeah, right.
And another big one is Act 10.
Okay.
And so Act 10 is a lot of right to work stuff. And it focuses on collective bargaining for public unions. It ended collective bargaining.
Yeah.
Which collective bargaining, for those that don't know, is where you can negotiate different things within your work. It's not related to wages. That didn't change anything with wages, but it changed it with like bonuses, different working conditions and things like that. And it's where you negotiate with your employer, but with a group of you do it. So it's like a union type thing.
Yeah. Do you mind if I add a little piece
Yeah.
here? So just for the listener's sake, this right to work stuff can be a little confusing. Act 10 and in school choice and all that, it's a lot to keep track of. So let's define right to work in Wisconsin. So right to work, or RTW in Wisconsin, it refers to a law that prohibits requiring workers to join a union or pay the union dues as a condition of their employment. This basically means that employers in unionized workspaces, they can't force these members to become unions or contribute financially to the union, even if the union is negotiating on their behalf, if that makes sense. So the union basically represents all workers, regardless, of union status. But typically, some unions will say that they only represent, union workers, but these unions will represent workers who may choose not to pay the union dues or be a part of the union. This right to work was passed in 2015, separate from Act 10, as a part of the Governor Scott Walker administration. It applies to what you're saying, the private sector employees as well as public sector unions, which had previously already been limited under Act 10. So yeah, that's just a little piece on right to work.
No, that's really good. And so to know, this kind of where they stand on this, we know that Crawford led a lawsuit against Act 10, and we know that she's completely against it. Yeah. And she does not hesitate to campaign on that. And, and Schimel is on the opposite side, where he doesn't see anything constitutionally wrong with Act 10.
Right. He served in the administration that passed Act 10 served in the administration. He was partnered with the Walker administration as DA. Exactly.
So, so that's that. Couple other big ones, voter ID.
Yes.
That's likely, especially with this, if this amendment doesn't get passed, especially.
Yeah,
it's likely to go before the court. And Crawford has said that voter ID is draconian.
I wonder how you square that circle.
Right. Like, what? She thinks that it's not fair to people with disabilities and I think minority groups is what she said during the debate.
Sure, yeah.
So we'll talk more about voter ID later on.
Okay, yeah.
But the big one that, we hear a lot about is the 1849 abortion law.
Right.
I think I've talked a little bit about this before on the podcast. My opinion is I think it'll be decided before he takes his seat if he's elected.
The reasoning on that, correct me if I'm wrong on this. So the way I've heard it is the reasoning on this abortion case and why the Democrats typically hawk to abortion, and they kind of are, but not nearly as much as they typically do. And the Republicans, I have, my own quarrel with this. The life issue is a big one for me personally. I think it's a big one for most Generation Z conservatives. But the theory behind why this abortion case won't necessarily be as prominent during this election is that if Schimel were to be elected, they'll hear the case before he gets on the bench.
Right.
If he does get elected, they'll hear it before he hits the bench. If he doesn't get elected, it doesn't matter. They can hear it before he gets there or after, and they'll be able to decide the case either way.
Exactly. That's most likely what's to happen. But there's a chance that it doesn't happen that way.
There's always a chance.
So we need to vote accordingly.
Yeah.
And there's a chance it comes back.
It could always come back. Right.
So, because a big reason why they're against the abortion law is because it doesn't have an exception for rape.
Okay.
And so could be a reason that it comes back is they could add in, that exception.
I see.
And then moving on, a big one as well is the congressional maps.
Yes, this is huge.
Right.
Yeah.
And we see both sides redraw maps constantly, but the current way they want to redraw it is to draw out Representative Derek Van Orden out
from
of
his congressional district.
Right.
Yeah.
And, that's just, it's so unfair. And it's like, why do we have to play these games? Why can't we just work with what we have?
Yeah, I know.
And they actually want to take him out of his seat, like this term.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's where I wanted to go with this is, they say that the term saying the quiet part out loud, and Representative and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries said on an interview, I want to say with PBS, I'm not totally sure, don't quote me on that, But he said in an interview the other day that they expect to pick up 2 congressional seats if they win this election. I mean, and that's just brazen partisanship where it's like they're cloaking it by saying the maps are already unconstitutional and unfair. Well, I mean, the maps had been ruled on multiple times saying that they were constitutional. And I will put a caveat out there. We both play this game. Like when the maps are drawn in an unfavorable way, we cry about how they're not fair. And I respect that that's a part of the political process, but it is important to note that these maps have been ruled on multiple times. And it's clear when they're saying it out loud that this is just a partisan push to redraw and have a better shake at the House.
No, absolutely. And so that's definitely something, we need to keep in mind when we're voting this election.
Yeah.
And these are just the ones we know of. Likely there's going to be other things that will come before the court, especially if Crawford wins. They're going to try and get things before the court to try and set them in stone. And so, Second Amendment rights could come up.
Certainly.
First Amendment rights could come up.
Yeah.
And transgender athletes in locker rooms is a very likely one to end up coming before the court at some point. And so there's a lot of big stuff going on here. And so, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah.
How are you feeling about the race?
Very nervous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult thing to call. I mean, nobody can call it, but the Democrats seem very energized, and they
have a lot of money in it.
Yeah, they're putting themselves together. And for all the talk about Elon Musk being involved, and personally, I think we mentioned the other day that, the idea of out of state dollars coming into a state to prop up a candidate probably isn't totally the most ethical way of doing it either way, Republican or Democrat. But considering that this is the game that's played, the Democrats love to say, well, Elon Musk is buying this seat. And she had that one-liner in that debate where she called him Elon Schimel or whatever.
Yeah.
It's so silly because it's like, it's not just this election, but in the past Supreme Court election, Janet Protasiewicz received literally millions of dollars from the Pritzker Foundation and from Soros Foundation. And same now in this one. I mean, they're not getting as much as some of the large dollar donors coming to Schimel, but they're equally receiving millions of dollars of out-of-state dollars.
And I believe Crawford's receiving much more percentage-wise.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was reading a little bit. She actually, back to your question, how do I feel? Something that really does concern me for Schimel's sake is she's out fundraising him small dollar donations 2-1.
Yeah.
And that was Trump 2016 when people look at that election and they're like, how in the world did Trump beat Clinton? She had everybody. She had all of the money and she had all of the fame. Where Trump killed her was small dollar donations. He had an unheard of amount of small dollar donations, which reflects the individual person, the voters' enthusiasm for the candidate. And so I think that's where I have a little bit of pause. But yeah, how do you feel? What do you think?
Yeah, I know that I believe it was Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce came out with a poll and they're tied at 47%.
Okay.
And so it could go either way, I go off of kind of what I see on campus right now, which we know we have a very liberal campus, so take it with a grain of salt. But, we see quite a few people excited to vote for Crawford. But I will say every time I've been out there tabling, I have had a few dozen people come up excited, knowing about the candidate and excited to vote. We've helped to register quite a few voters. Yeah. And, and then there's plenty of people we talk to who don't even know about it. And we talk to them, and then they learn about the candidate, and they go, "Oh yeah, he's who I would support."
Yeah, right.
And so I think that helps, and I think truly being backed by the sheriffs like he is,
it's a big deal.
Is huge, especially because his job is to be a justice on the Supreme Court. Right. He's not running as a legislator, and being backed by sheriffs is very good for justice.
You mentioned something really, really important there that I wanted to touch on when you say he's not running as a legislator, he's running as a justice. So I wanted to quick touch on the philosophy of Brad Schimel. So you hear a lot in judicial elections about this word activist judge thrown around. When you look at Susan Crawford, she's someone who and Janet Protasiewicz in the former election. These are people who are indicating that they're going to rule a certain way on certain cases that haven't even been brought yet. They call that being an activist judge. It's somebody who goes to the bench with the intent of ruling from a political stance, not because you're facing the facts of the case and you're ruling just based on that incorrectly. You're ruling based on your preconceived political understanding of an issue. And where Brad Schimel differs is he has what's called an originalist philosophy. So the originalist philosophy basically means he's interpreting the state constitution based on and in the United States Constitution based on the intent of the framers.
Right.
He emphasizes that the judicial restraint is very integral to the integrity of the position, where you as a justice or a judge, you sit and you hear impartially on these cases. That's the bedrock of the judicial system, is that you have a judge in the position who's not going to look at you and make a personal opinion about you or a personal opinion about your case. He or she is just going to look at the case for what it is and rule on it based on that. And so I think that's really important to note is if you care about that, that's great. If you don't, you should, because it's vitally important to all of us who, for whatever reason may at some point in our lives end up in front of a judge or for whatever reason,
that's a very good point that you make. And I talked with New York Times yesterday, and that was their first question is, what's at stake? And my answer was along the lines of our justice system, our entire framework of our Constitution. If we don't have a justice system, we don't have a functioning America.
Absolutely.
And America is built with these checks and balances, and the ultimate balance is the justice system. And so I think that's a very good point there about, making sure that we're preserving that. And we know that he is very dedicated to that as well.
Right. And, it's not to derail, but this is kind of a huge topic of conversation nationally right now, specifically with Trump and his executive orders is, are these judges legislating from the bench? Are they stepping in the way of the process that is outlined for the duly elected executive to carry out? I mean, there's a theory popularized by Antonin Scalia called the unitary executive theory, which states that the executive should be in charge of the executive branch and the functionings that go on within that branch. And so specifically with Donald Trump, but we could apply it to the state where, there's, these issues will come about where, there's a question of who has the authority here.
Right.
Well, the unitary executive theory believes that the executive is in charge of the executive branch. So if Trump wants to do something with the Department of Education, it falls under the executive branch. It's his prerogative.
Yeah.
Where you get a little bit of controversy or disagreement is other people believe that we need to allow the courts to step in the way of everything, which to me, to a lot of people, regardless of if it's a Republican or a Democrat, it does seem to be undermining the will of the people in a way.
Right.
Where Trump's, issuing an executive order on say foreign policy, which is the specific one where he's sending those migrants, the criminal migrants, back to their country.
Right.
This circuit court judge thinks he can just step in the way. There's a lot of questions of do judges really have the authority to step in the way of the president's foreign policy decisions? It's this whole I don't want to call it a constitutional crisis, but we're getting to this point where if the left continues to nominate and then elect these activist judges to these positions, they're in an end around way creating this almost impossible bridge to gap, because you'll have the legislature stepping in the way, and then ultimately you have the judiciary legislating from the bench, stepping in the way of the duly elected executive. We're speaking at a national scale here, but we could dumb this down to the state level. Granted, it wouldn't the analogy doesn't work as well because we have a Democrat governor, but
you make a really good point. I think the other thing to consider here too is state Supreme Court is elected differently than the national,
right?
And national is elected by the president,
nominated, right?
Yeah. And then they go through
appointed by the Senate.
Yeah, exactly. They go through that whole Senate hearing, where we don't see that here in the state, and I'm not sure why that is. Actually, I find it really interesting that we do it that way, because now they have to campaign. Yeah. And how do you get votes? by telling people what they want to hear.
No, right.
And so
That's
it
a great
does kind of bring up
point to
this
bring up.
moral issue
Yeah.
of how can they have integrity and run a campaign.
Run on an election? Yeah,
Right,
that
like,
makes sense.
They can't make any promises.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all they can promise is that
They're going to rule fairly.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a really interesting.
Right, with a wink and a nod, and that's the gross part about it is, you know, either way, it's like, you know, if Brad Schimel gets elected, we know who he is, we know what he wants to do.
Right.
Of course, that's why we're electing him. Same with the Democrats, and I really like that point that, you know, maybe there's something to this. People like to think, oh, well, you know, there's less democracy that way, but it keeps the integrity of the role.
Well, it's the same.
You know.
It's
intact.
The same reason that senators don't represent the state anymore. You know, and that's a whole topic we could get into. Is senators used to be elected by the state?
Yeah, appointed.
Appointed by
right.
the state,
yeah.
and now they're elected by the people.
Yeah, that is a really interesting topic to talk about.
That's something you know we should totally look into doing a future episode on because there's a lot of sides to that.
There is controversy over that.
Oh
too.
yeah, absolutely. But we see this quite often, you know, impact how they run their elections. I guess is, you know, the point there. Okay, we ready to move on to segment 2?
Absolutely.
So, segment 2, we're going to talk about Brittany Kinser, who's the next one on your ballot. She's running for state superintendent. And so your state superintendent is who's going to set in place how education is going to work in Wisconsin. They help with curriculum stuff. They help funding is a huge one. Different initiatives for things like school choice. And kind of setting some guidelines for things like the school and the school board. And so this is a big race if we want to take back our school system.
Right.
And she's running against Jill Underly, who's the incumbent.
Okay.
And Brittany Kinser just came as a special education teacher. She taught in the Chicago public schools for about 10 years. And she then moved to Milwaukee and became a principal there. Actually, she received an award from the then state superintendent, Tony Evers, who's now our governor.
Really? I didn't know he was state superintendent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, he won't endorse Jill Underly.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I did not know that. Why is that?
Good question. So, yeah. That is very interesting. And she's served as executive director of a national public charter school network and CEO of a Milwaukee education nonprofit that's focused on just getting every kid educated and educating them well.
Oh, good.
And then she's co-founded 95 Wisconsin, which is what she's most well known for.
What is that?
It's an initiative with the goal of getting 95% of Wisconsin children to achieve reading proficiency.
Oh, wow.
So that they're reading at the grade level.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so...
Which there's a lot of very frightening statistics about grade level.
I want to say it's like 80% of 8th graders can't...
No, I wouldn't doubt if it was more.
Yeah.
Like, I've seen some statistics that I can't even, like, believe.
It's insane.
Totally unbelievable. Which I wonder what role COVID has and all that.
That is a very good point, too, yeah. And so... And they were the first state to work towards an initiative with this big of a goal.
Oh, good.
And so this is great to see. And so, yeah, some of her top issues is... Like I said, she wants to raise these Wisconsin standards. That's something she is going to continue to work towards in this new role. And the reason she got into the race was these Wisconsin standards because she was just a public school teacher, you know, and then principal, and she just loved kids. And then she saw these kids struggling to reach these standards, and she saw the state not doing anything. And she said, I have to do something.
Good on her.
And yeah, she's not at all somebody that's in it just for the political fame or anything like that. And so Jill Underly, is current state superintendent, actually lowered our standards because she wanted us to look better. She wanted to hide how poorly we're doing. So she said, if we lower the standards, they can make them.
Right, it makes it look better.
Right. And
that's classic.
Did not really communicate that well to the schools or the parents. And so it kind of just happened behind closed doors and it was like, oh, look, Wisconsin's doing great. Look how good I've improved reading scores.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, we're forgetting a part there. Yeah.
Right. And then Brittany Kinser also wants to focus on the reading, writing, and math within schools. Okay. There's all this focus on these extra stuff. And you have nothing if you don't have reading, writing, and math.
Yeah, right.
And so she wants to bring the focus back to that. Not that you can't have those other subjects,
Certainly.
like science is important, history is important.
Yeah.
These classes are very important, but you have to have these foundational skills. So she wants to make sure that those foundational skills are being met adequately. And the biggest thing is she wants to work with parents. For a long time, the school has not been open and honest with parents. I mean, from, things like transgenderism is a huge one.
Yeah, right.
I was talking to some people that were tabling, some liberals that come and table on our campus, and one of their biggest points against Jill Underling is she wants to tell parents if their kids come out as transgender. And I was like, well, yeah, I think if your kid is transitioning, you have the right to know that.
Yeah.
And, that's just
against
terrifying.
Brittany Kinser.
Right.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
And it's just terrifying to me that they want to hide things from parents. They want to make the schools their parents.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not one to throw this around a lot, but that's it's extremely Marxist coded.
Yeah. They do that.
Make the state the parent.
That is very
divide
true.
the family. And
I mean, next they're going to have kids turning in their parents,
Yeah.
So, yeah. And Jill Underly also opposes school choice. And school choice is huge. I mean,
that's a big one for you. Yeah.
Right. And I started out in private school.
Mm-hmm.
So right off the bat, school choice moment there. I then went to public school for a year. And then I was homeschooled. And then I went to public school again, but I went out of district.
Oh.
So 3 of the 4 schooling things that I did were only available because of school choice.
Mm.
And so I got a little taste of pretty much everything minus charter school.
Sure.
And, and it's what made my education so great because at the time, private school was a great place for me to start. Public school in my district was probably my worst. I was only there for a year. And then homeschool let me, learn at my own pace.
Yeah.
Let me learn what I wanted to learn.
Which homeschooling is becoming extremely popular.
Yeah. And it's great because parents know their kids.
Yeah.
And they can tailor the education
what a radical
to their
idea.
kids.
Yeah,
right.
Seriously.
And so, it's phenomenal. And then I went to out of district school because my parents wanted to send me to a school that was going to give me a good education. And they knew that I wanted to go into the sciences, and they were tired of me dissecting things in my garage. So after my biology class freshman year, they kicked me out and said, okay, you're going to public school.
Okay.
But they sent me out of district because it was a better school district.
Sure.
And so, yeah, that's some of the background behind why I'm so passionate about school choice. But the most interesting thing about Jill Underly and her thoughts on school choice is she sent her kids to a private school. But she's not pro-school choice.
Nice.
So classic Democrat there. But yeah, and then just funding at large, Brittany Kinser wants to give more responsibility back to the state as far as financial funding and stuff rather than relying on the local property taxes.
Oh, okay.
And she also wants to make sure that the funding is actually reaching the classroom.
Yeah.
And not just the administration, bureaucratic stuff.
Yeah, right.
And so that's, I think, huge. And then she has this really cool idea where she wants to create just an online dashboard for all the schools to find their guidelines for school boards for,
that's
performances,
great. Yeah.
finances, all that
You'd
stuff.
think you'd already have something
I know.
like
when
that.
I was reading that, I was like, is this not already a thing?
It's amazing. It's 2025 and like some of the most basic stuff is like
right.
a selling point nowadays.
Yeah. And then
which it should be.
Is,
if it's non-existent, it needs to be a selling point.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of where Brittany Kinser stands with everything. What are your thoughts on this race?
I'm less concerned, and I think it's just because I'm ignorant. Like I haven't taken the time to read.
Well, you're
or
also
be passionate.
not from the state either.
Yeah, originally, yeah, right. I mean, Wisconsin is my home, and I look to stay here post graduation, and so for that reason, it is important. And I'm a traditional guy. I'd like to get married and have kids, and and my girlfriend and I have talked about the homeschool and like this trend of homeschooling and. I was publicly educated my entire life, and I certainly see the value in public education, but the direction that the national public education trend seems to be going, it does make me lean a lot more towards private charter or home, and a pro private charter or home or pro at least traditional education superintendent is straight up my alley. And so for that reason, I certainly will be voting for Brittany Kinser, and I've advocated to my family to do as well. But yeah, I mean, I just don't know as much, and so for that reason, I can't necessarily give a prediction. But I certainly will throw my endorsement for Brittany Kinser.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you bring up a good point that right now the state of the school system, you want that option to private school or homeschool or whatever. And that can change. You can change your opinion on that. Oh,
certainly, yeah.
But you want that choice open.
Right.
And that's the whole point here. Okay, our last and final segment for tonight, we are talking about the voter ID constitutional amendment. And so for those that don't know, this on your ballot, it'll say photographic identification for voting. Shall Section 1M of Article 3 of the Constitution be created to require that voters present valid photographic identification verifying their identity in order to vote in any election, subject to expectations which may be established by law. And then you say, yes.
Yeah. Of course you should have an ID to vote.
Right. And so people are like, okay, well, why do we need this? If we have already passed referendums, legislation, but you want it in the Constitution.
Yes.
Because if it goes before the court and it's in the Constitution,
it's bedrock.
They can't go against the Constitution.
Yeah.
And so that's
in theory.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Unless you're super activist, which goes back to the original point.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's kind of where we're at with that one. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Yeah. I know Dems say that they see it as a poll tax.
Yeah,
I had somebody tell me today that they're going to require a passport for you to vote, and passports are too hard to get. I then followed up with, "Oh, you're going to need a passport to vote?" And he said, "Well, that's what they want eventually."
A passport?
And I was like, "Okay, sure."
I mean, isn't it just ironic too? Not to slam dunk, but it is just like, remember, like 5 years ago, like the Democrats were like ready to make us all have, vaccine identification to like go to your local Walmart.
That is such a good point.
And now it's like we're like, okay, well, I think that's a little intrusive, but like, hey, to like cast a vote, you should just be able to prove that you are the citizen who you say that you are.
Right. And it's not saying you have to get a photo ID that says I am a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
It's just to verify, because they already know that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just verifying that you're the person that they have written down.
Yeah.
That's all it's doing.
It's just identifying who you are as a voter.
Right.
I mean, we live in a country where we have, in theory, we have more authority than pretty much any humans really have ever had over their government in all of human history. And that's an immense privilege. But it can get really, really scary if people, are frauding the system or doing, nefarious activities. And one basic but necessary safeguard for that is just to prove identification. And we could go down the laundry list of, you got to go. You and I and some of the members of the club last night after the rally, we went out for a few drinks to celebrate, and all of us had to prove ID.
Right.
And it's like, and when I go into a gas station and you need to get something behind the counter, ID.
Right.
When you go buy a fishing and a hunting license in the state, ID.
Yeah.
You have to prove it. You have to prove your identification for many airports. I mean, it's a laundry list of things, and it's very, very telling when there's this much backlash against as something as simple as just proving that you are who you say you are when you're going to cast your vote. And and for me, it's like when they say it's a poll tax or they say it's all this different stuff, it's total conjecture. It's all just this political rhetoric to try and scare people away and lock people into a narrow-minded way of thinking. I mean, you don't even need to be a partisan conservative Republican to understand the importance of voter identification.
If you care about election integrity, you want voter identification.
Right.
Like, it's that simple.
Well, and famously, I mean, this is like mail-in ballot stuff, but Barack Obama and the Democrats in, pre-2012 were very anti-mail-in ballot. They were very pro having to prove identification because the only people who were doing mail-in ballots or were doing, or maybe didn't have identification are seniors who typically vote Republican.
Right.
And so, it's like I would have to go back, but I mean, I would hope we were always pro voter ID, but it's very interesting that now there's this stark backlash against voter identification, specifically coming from the Democrat Party. It's just there's no way to square that circle. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
No, I totally agree with you there. And with that being said, this is why it's important to go vote. Because if we don't vote this election, we may never have a fair election again. and from the Supreme Court to the voter ID constitutional amendment, all of these things are providing a future for our state.
Absolutely.
Each and every one of these is so crucial to our future. And so go vote on Tuesday. Go cast your vote for Brett Schimel, Brittany Kinser, and yes to the amendment.
Yes, right.
And bring your friends.
Tell your loved ones.
Right.
Yeah.
And find somebody who doesn't usually vote, or who, a lot of conservatives vote in the fall elections and not in the spring.
And that is the biggest key piece that we need to leave you, the listener, with today. Is there, on average, are 200 to 250,000 Wisconsin registered Republican voters who vote in November but don't vote in April.
Yeah.
If we could just get that margin to like 60%, you can just get a little bit of that, we win.
Right.
And so it's not even that we need to go and change hearts and minds and be, fighting with your liberal aunt or uncle.
No.
You just need to get your parents, your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, your friends who vote Trump, vote red, vote conservative to vote in April. You don't even need to show up on April 1st. We don't even do same day elections anymore.
Right.
It's like
you have until Sunday.
You literally got like a full week
I think Saturday's the last day.
Yeah, right. So get out there this weekend, or get out there on April 1st and make sure that you tell your friends and family, because this. And I was on the phone with my mom earlier, and I said this to her, and I hope I'm wrong, but this could be one of these elections where, like, 10 years from now, we're looking back at Wisconsin, which is a totally different place than the one we all remember and grew up in.
Absolutely.
And we're going to look back at this moment right now and say this was the moment that it turned, from teetering to worse, and we want to protect against that.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, before we leave off tonight, I've been meaning to do this, but I wanted to give a special shout out to our listener, Christina from Illinois. I know you are a dedicated listener, and we very much appreciate your support. If anybody would like a shout out on our next episodes, go ahead and email the College Republicans email, DM us on any of our social medias, and we'd be happy to give you a shout out. With that being said, thanks for listening to Right on Campus. We post this podcast weekly where we tackle current events and life as a conservative on campus. If you'd like to learn more about UWEC College Republicans, join our meetings on Monday nights in Centennial 1704 at 7 p.m. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at UWEC College Republicans, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, and favorite and share this podcast if you're listening on Spotify. Have a great night. Thank you for listening to Right on Campus. We post this podcast once a week where we talk about current events and life as a conservative on campus. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at UWEC College Republican. Have a great night, and see you next time.